All right, you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. And I'm going to get straight into it because, again, I got a couple stories that I'm trying to get out to you guys, and I want to get straight to them. So let me get straight into this story. This right here is a banger. This is about a homicide that took place in the LA County Jail. It's a brutal story, and these types of things happen everywhere in different county jails, in different prisons, but it's prevalent in the LA County Jail. The LA County Jail, for those of you that haven't been there, is probably one of the worst county jails in the state of California. There's other county jails that are just as bad, but the LA County Jail is probably one of the worst. So anyways, like I said, this story took place in the LA County Jail in an area called 3400 B-Row. And let me just say this. This is a good story for some of you youngsters that still think that there's some glory in doing time, or who think they'll gain some type of rite of passage insofar as credibility when going to jail or prison. This is one of the biggest misconceptions there could possibly be. And this notion is all predicated on a serious lack of intelligence. Anyways, for those of you that haven't had the unfortunate experience of being a customer in the LA County Jail, from my understanding, this massive complex is broken down into 3 different facilities. Comprised of 1 processing facility, the Inmate Reception Center. There's 3 men's jails: Men's Central Jail, Twin Towers Correctional Facility, and the Pitches Detention Center. East, North, South, and North County Correctional Facility. And then, of course, you have the Women's Jail, Regional Detention Facility in Linwood. So again, this story, it took place in an area of the jail called 3400. This is a module, and from everything that I've been able to gather, this area of the jail is considered medium and maximum security, as they have lockdown units that are combined in these modules. And apparently they house influential and problematic gang members in this area of the jail. The high-profile hardcore gang members are housed in another part of the jail. The high-profile hardcore gang members, or those that are considered part of leadership, are housed in 1750 or high power. I believe they also have another part of the jail called 1700, but I'm not clear if this is just an area that has single-man cells or if this is also an area that's also considered high power. So this story, for all you sticklers that want specific times, dates, whereabouts, and all that good stuff, this story took place sometime in September of 1998. And because so much time has lapsed, there's a good possibility that some of the housing designations might have changed. So at this time, Module 3200 A-Row housed Hispanic gangs. Module 3400 B-Row also housed Hispanic gangs. Module 3200 B-Row housed white gangs. And Module 3400 D-Row housed Asian gangs. However, although Module 3400 D-Row is designated for housing Asian gangs, it was being used as a lockdown module when this story took place. And just like every other jail in the state of California, or anywhere else for that matter, this jail required you to go in front of a classification committee so that they could conduct a brief interview and determine the appropriate housing for every inmate that goes through that jail. Status and affiliation determines housing placement. And because the LA County Jail is such a massive complex, I want to say that it has a classification unit that's tied into Operation Safe Streets. So as I said, when this story took place, Module 3400 B-Row was being used as a lockdown module. Doors are locked or unlocked either manually or electronically by deputies who sit in an officer's cage. But one of the common occurrences that happened in that part of the jail regularly, as it does in other jails that are similar to this type of housing unit, was for inmates to jam their door or prop something in the crack of their doors so that they could enter or leave their cell at will. A spoon, a pencil, a piece of paper, anything that would keep the door open. So the walkway in front of the cells, that's usually called a tier, is referred to as the freeway or the row. One of the things that you're always going to find in different county jails is that inmates always designate names for different parts of the jail. Just like I told you guys about the Santa Clara County Jail having an area that was called Siberia. Anyways, I'm sure you guys all know the LA County Jail is considered a stronghold or a power base for the Mexican Mafia. They have complete dominance and control over all the Sureño inmates in the 3 jails, and they even exert a level of control over the Mexican nationals or the paisas in the jail. And although there's a lot of gang rivalries throughout Southern California between different gangs, different hoods out there, Those rivalries stop at the front door, and they all understand that they fall collectively under the Mexican Mafia's authority and control. They're also mandated to conform to the policies, protocols, and dictates set forth by the Mexican Mafia. Like other criminal organizations such as the NF and the AB, the Mexican Mafia requires its members, subordinates, and manpower to function under a structured program. Policies vary depending on the Mexican Mafia member that's in charge of the jail at that time. However, there are some common standard policies that are always in effect. Some examples could be that all sureños are required to maintain their own personal hygiene daily and keeping the common areas of their living quarters clean and respectable. The NF does the same thing. It's all about respect. Some of the other required policies might be keeping a weapon accessible and ready in all housing units. They might be required to be suited and booted at a certain designated time. There's morning and night guiles or roll calls. There's policies with respects to the rules of engagement with other ethnicities, meaning you can't just take off on somebody else from a different ethnicity, obviously because it might cause a war. And then there's strict policies in effect that forbid their following from fraternizing and interacting with certain ethnic groups, certain affiliations, and other individuals that have been deemed enemies. In some of the housing units, usually on some of the max tiers, there's usually a designated time for shutdown when they sign off as a showing of respect for everybody else on the tier or in that module. The Mexican Mafia also requires a certain percentage of any drugs or money that come into the county jail. The Mexican Mafia also requires its following to contribute a certain percentage of any drugs or money that come into the county jail. Like the NF, the Mexican Mafia floats this as making an honorable contribution to the casa or the house. And the whole purpose is to create a stock reserve for the less fortunate, those that don't have the financial means to take care of themselves. However, this is just another form of taxation by those at the top who are just taking another piece of pie for their own personal use or expenditure. Then there's policies pertaining to conduct and discipline that are also strictly enforced. Then there's consequences or penalties for any infractions or a break in any of the policies. So just for the purpose of helping some of you understand this story, understand that the Mexican Mafia keeps a running list of all the sureños that owe any cleanup or those who owe any discipline. There's varying degrees of discipline, and then there's also covert codes that are used to maintain the Mexican Mafia's strict measure of secrecy. So in September of 1998, several members of the Northside Redondo gang, NSR, were housed together in cell 5 in module 3400 B-row. Crow, Blackie, Stryker, and Flaco were all from Northside Redondo. Capone from Orange Street, Norwalk, was celled up with the two Llaveros for that module, Gypsy and Negro. Interestingly enough, I met this guy Capone in the Santa Clara County Jail sometime around 2008 or 2009. His real name was Roland Ramirez, and he was being held in the Santa Clara County Jail as he was considered a high-profile witness who had testified in several Mexican Mafia indictments. So a few cells down from Capone, Gypsy, and Negro in cell 10 was another individual by the name of Güero from Eastside Torrance. According to my source, who I'm now going to refer to as Thumper, Güero was apparently in hot water and had been in trouble. He had fell into debt several times over drugs that he had got on consignment. But up until this incident, he was fortunate enough to have family who agreed to pay these debts that he had accumulated. So as a result, he was given a pass. But Thumper said that Güero also found himself in a serious quandary for not giving the required 1/3 of the drugs to the Mexican Mafia that he was getting smuggled into the county jail. According to Thumper, Güero was getting an ounce of heroin smuggled into the county jail bi-weekly, basically every other week. But instead of reporting that he was getting an ounce, he lied about how much dope he was really getting and claimed he was only getting 1/3 of an ounce so that he would only have to kick in a couple of grams. You know, when you do something wrong in this lifestyle and later on others try to buddy up to you, at some point you gotta know that you're walking into the lion's den and that you're exposing yourself. Güero's mistake was putting trust in some of the other sureños that were housed with him in cell 10. He assumed that by getting them loaded and sharing his dope with them, that they keep it secret and that they wouldn't out him. There's an old adage that says, the best kept secret is the one that you keep to yourself. Again, he assumed that by turning them on to some dope and by getting them high, that they wouldn't say nothing. However, there's some sureños that consider burning, scamming, or skimming off of the Mexican mafia a serious violation. But then there's another part of this that also made it kind of personal for Stryker. And again, Stryker was another sureño from Redondo Beach that was housed on the same tier with Weddle. In fact, Stryker was Weddle's channel. So when Weddle would get his dope in every other week, he would then give whatever he had to contribute to High Power, he'd give that to Stryker. And then Stryker would forward that to the two Llaveros, Gypsy and Negro, who would then forward it to 1750, High Power. But because Weddle was lying about the amount of dope he was getting in, Stryker felt like Weddle was potentially putting him in a cross, and that the big homies in High Power might have assumed that he was pinching from it. So Stryker took that as a personal affront and had him in his crosshairs. Anyways, like most county jails or prisons, the Mexican mafia allows the sureños to bring drugs into these facilities if they have the means or connections. They're free to do this at their own discretion, and they allow them to get their own hustle on and sell their dope as they see fit. For the Mexican mafia, this is a win-win situation. They get a portion of the drugs off the top, and this is also a way to keep track and maintain those open pipelines. Smuggling drugs into the county jails or prisons, a lot of the times it's based on an individual's own established resources and through the assistance of their families. Sometimes a pipeline could be opened up through the visiting room. Sometimes it might come from a corrupted CO who's in pocket, a free staff person that's involved in a personal relationship, or by some other means where a lapse in that facility's security has been breached. In other words, if you're in a county jail or you're in one of these state prisons and you have a relative or a close associate that's willing to bring drugs in, the Mexican mafia is always going to encourage you to do it. And that would be your operation that they would allow you to maintain some level of discretion over. This, however, is predicated on trust. Obviously, there's always going to be an expectation of honesty. As long as you're forthright, straight up about what's coming in, and you maintain the business level of it, you're not going to get crossed up. And here's the thing. Officer-inmate relationships happen more frequently than people think. Just trust me on that. It happens all the time. Maybe a sureño gets involved in a relationship with one of the female officers, and eventually he convinces her over time to bring drugs in. That kind of thing happens all the time. And I've told you guys about this in some of my other videos. Nobody's going to put their career on the line overnight. These kind of things take time. Even with some of the male officers, you build common ground, and over time, you start with something small, maybe a pen filler, maybe a little bit of ODR food from the officer's dining hall, then maybe a little bit of home-cooked food, and then it continues to escalate until you get to the point to where drugs and alcohol start coming in, maybe tobacco, lighters, weapons. I've seen it and done it all. They come from compromised COs that have been corrupted. Or like this next video I'm about to show you guys, where this inmate obviously identified a lapse in that prison's security and had somebody from the outside helping him. He must have identified an area where there was an unmanned gun tower, or where there were no cameras in that area of the prison, or something that led him to believe that he could have somebody run up to that fence, throw it over, and he could get it back in. On second thought, I take that back about the camera. Obviously, if there was a camera there to record him, there was a camera. But maybe he thought that camera wasn't working. But anyways, watch this next video. This guy has one of his boys run up to one of the perimeters of the fence, and then he throws a backpack full of drugs and weapons over the fence. The exchange is not a graceful one, but this guy climbs up the fence and he finally gets it. Obviously, this was wide open right here. And just use your imagination on what could have came in inside that backpack. a backpack that big. But I think in that situation, the Mexican mafia would definitely want to exert some control over that pipeline and use it for themselves. In fact, they encourage them to do this if they can, because they're required to contribute a third of whatever comes in. So when the Mexican mafia members in 1750 heard about Weddle from Torrance and how he lied about the amount of drugs he was bringing in, they sent word back to make sure that Weddle was the lucky recipient of a forest lawn. The term forest lawn was a code word that meant to take Weddle's life. Now, I'm sure that they resorted to drastic measures because, for one, they take someone stealing from them personal. And for two, this serves as an example for anyone else who might consider doing the same thing. So being that Gypsy and Negro were the two Llaveros in 3400, they were the ones that were responsible for communicating with leadership in 1750. They were also responsible for making sure that any ensuing discipline or green lights were properly administered. So as a direct result of the trouble that Weddle was in, Thumper said he was getting packed out daily with 39-second hard checks. He said they were constantly beating him up. Thumper said he stayed walking around looking like a raccoon. Every time one of his black eyes would go away, he'd get another one. But Thumper also said that these 39-second hard checks were just a temporary countermeasure that they were administering until he paid the final balance of a fine he had just been docked with. So Weddle's old lady, her name was Shannon, apparently had already met with Negro Senora, and she had already made a couple installments on the debt that he owed. But I guess she was still supposed to make 2 or 3 more installments before that debt was cleared. So according to Thumper, sometime in the early part of September, Weddle talked to his old lady Shannon again, and she assured him that she would meet with Negro's girl later on that same night, the same day he talked to her. But unfortunately for Weddle, his girl Shannon ended up delegating that task to her roommate, who ended up flaking. Of course, this didn't bode well for Weddle, that the money never exchanged hands. But it wouldn't have mattered whether she showed up or not. Weddle's fate had already been decided. It was just a matter of getting confirmation from 1750 and then putting the plan in motion. And besides that, they had other targets in 3400 that they wanted to knock down before they moved on Weddle. Weddle wasn't a threat and he wasn't going nowhere. So they put him on the back burner. On a side note, this is a good example of what happens to dudes like Weddle that get fronted dope. And then their ladies or families don't understand the severity of the circumstances involved when it comes to paying that money back. No matter how much you try to explain the politics and the consequences that these types of environments operate under, they'll never fully get it. But guys like Weddle fall victim to their own addictions by getting dope fronted to them in the first place. This is one of the first things you learn about prison, that you don't get caught up in drug or gambling debts. And then you turn around and put the burden on your old lady or your family who really don't understand the gravity of that debt. That's not the type of chances that you want to take. But believe it or not, this is a common thing that happens all the time. I've literally heard dudes begging and pleading with their moms on the phone, telling them that they're going to get murked if they don't come up with a certain amount of money that they're on the hook for. One cat played on his mom's emotions, and when she told him that she didn't have the money that he was asking for, this fool actually allowed her to sell a refrigerator to get that money. That's sad. But anyway, Thumper said that the green light on Weddle came sometime in the early part of September, right after his lady failed to pay the other part of the debt that he still owed. He was a walking target for about a week. And again, the only reason that he lasted that long is because they had other targets in 3400 that they wanted to knock down first. The other target was an individual by the name of Champ. Thumper said he doesn't remember where he was from, but he seems to think that he might have been from Venice. So Capone, Blackie, Stryker, Flacco, and some of the other Sureños in 3400 were all supposed to participate in the hit on Champ in some type of way, whether it was getting a piece, creating a diversion, being a shooter, or a bomber. They were all involved on some level. Capone from Norwalk agreed to get the weapons, and then the plan was to hit Champ when he came out for shower. So during showers, the two shooters who had weapons waited for Champ to get popped out for showers. There was nothing complicated about this hit. Everything was pretty basic. They waited until it was his turn to shower, and then when he came out, they rushed out and they hit him. And according to Thumper, everything happened exactly as they planned it. However, the attempt on Champ's life was a fail. I guess they were supposed to take his wind, but it didn't happen. He was stabbed multiple times. He was kicked. He was punched. He was stomped out. But his injuries weren't life-threatening, and he survived the attack. He did, however, require hospitalization. And this angered both Gypsy and Negro, the two Llaveros. It angered them because they looked at it as being a direct reflection on them, since they were the Llaveros. In some way, they felt like it made them look incompetent and incapable of carrying out that particular assignment. However, after Champ was hit, everybody in 3400 flooded their cells to wash away the blood and in an effort to conceal the identities of those who participated in the hit. Thumper said that not only did they flood the tier, but they also lit fires and trashed the tier. And in some ways, this was a diversion. So when something like this happens, where everybody floods the tier and they got to clean that shit up, they usually come back through and shake down that whole tier. And that's what they did. So apparently when they searched cell 5, one of the deputies found 2 weapons and an improvised handcuff key. The same cell where this next incident with Weddle would end up taking place. So after this failed hit on Champ, Stryker assured both Gypsy and Negro that the hit on Weddle would be handled right, that it would get done right. The plan with Weddle was to lure him into cell 5 under the notion that they were going to use some heroin and get him loaded. Something Weddle didn't even think twice about. They preyed on his weakness and this blinded him. After they got Weddle in the cell, then the 4 of them would stab, beat, and strangle Weddle to death. So Stryker presented this plan to one of the Llaveros, Gypsy, who then said this should be cakewalk. Allegedly, Gypsy approved the plan and said something to the effect of, he won't stand a chance against the 4 of you. So according to Thumper, on the day that this incident took place, Stryker went to Gypsy's cell and got a little bit of heroin that was going to be used to bait Weddle. Stryker told Gypsy, I'm going to use a little bit of this dope with that piece of shit to lure him into the cell, and then the rest is history. So at some point, Stryker communicates that to Weddle. He tells him to come to cell 5 and he's going to get him loaded. So keep in mind, Weddle was housed in cell 10. But when he came back into the module, I don't know where he was coming from. He told the deputy that he lived in cell 5. The deputy didn't have no reason to doubt him. So he opened up cell 5 and he allowed Weddle to go in. Again, the deputy didn't question it. When Weddle told him that's where he lived, he popped the door open and let him walk in. You know, when I think about this though, it tells me that either that CO wasn't a regular in that unit or that Weddle wasn't in that module for too long. Because usually these COs that work there, that's their housing unit, they remember who's where, what cell you live in, what they call you, and things like that. But the fact that this CO didn't question it and didn't really know where he lived made me believe that maybe he was just working there for the day. But unfortunately for Weddle, they set a trap and he walked right into it. Fat, dumb, and happy. Weddle, obviously oblivious to everything going on, thinking that he's going to go in the cell and get loaded, he walks in. After the CO popped the door, he shut the door behind him and he locked it. So the only 3 that were assigned to cell 5 was Stryker, Blackie, and Flacco. Crow was actually assigned to cell 6, but he slid into cell 5 so that he could participate in this hit. So when Weddle walks into the cell, Crow and Blackie were standing in the back of the cell and Flacco was sitting on his bunk. Stryker was standing by the sink getting some water that they were going to use to prepare the dope. According to Thumper, there was no formal plan with regards to how they were going to move on Weddle. So Crow, Blackie, and Stryker had all done time before in the past. And the 3 of them were priming Flacco up as he was getting ready to go to prison for the first time. And Flacco knew that they were going to hit Weddle, but he just kind of laid back and allowed the other 3 to take lead roles. So the first thing Stryker did after they were all in the cell is to split the dope that he had with Weddle. Stryker cut it in half, and then he commenced to preparing his for himself. So after he does his half, the 4 of them made small talk with Weddle and watched him as he was preparing his. As soon as Weddle was done doing his half, Stryker didn't waste no time. He came up behind him and he put him in a chokehold. Crow and Blackie then swooped in and they both started bombing on him. Bing, bop, bop, bing, bing, bop, 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 bing, bop, bop, bing, bing, bop, bop, bing, bing, bop, bop, bing, bop. So Flacco was sitting on his bunk, but when Blackie and Crow took off on Weddle, he knew that this was his cue, and that's when he jumped off his bunk and he started throwing punches with the other two. Keep in mind, from my understanding, these cells are not that big. So you got 5 cats in there tussling around. They were probably hitting everything in that cell. Anyways, at one point, the 4 of them end up taking Weddle down to the floor, and they continue to beat him. Crow, Blackie, and Flacco kept throwing punches and kicks while Stryker continued to choke him. All Weddle could really do at this point was to try to twist his body out of the chokehold and turn his head so that he could breathe. But eventually, this was to no avail. Blackie and Crow both caught on to what Weddle was doing. So at one point, they grabbed his arms and they pinned him down so he couldn't move. It was probably at this point right here that Weddle realized that he was in a bad situation. Think about it. You get lured into a cell with 4 other guys, and then at some point, you realize it's a trap. But by then, it's too late. There's nothing that you can do about it but fight back and delay the inevitable. I'm sure there was a split second when Weddle thought to himself, I fucked up. These fools are going to take me out. How did I allow myself to get put in this situation? When Stryker felt him go limp, he let him go, got up off the floor, and then pulled a banger out that he had in his waistband. The banger was a flat piece of steel that measured about 8 inches in length and had a strip of sheet wrapped around the other end to serve as a handle. This was the worst case scenario for Weddle, laying there vulnerable and exposed in a cell with 4 individuals who had bad intentions. So Stryker bent down over Weddle and he stabs him 3 times in the neck. After Stryker stabs him in the neck, he stabs him 3 or 4 more times in the left side of his chest, obviously trying to target his heart. Like I told you guys in my last story, this was one of those nasty pieces that you would look at and say, damn, whoever gets hit with this is a done deal. So after Stryker stabbed Weddle, he handed the weapon to Blackie and he told him to get his. And although he didn't say it, this was symbolic of making sure that everybody had blood on their hands. So Blackie stabs Weddle in the chest about 6 times over his heart before he sunk the blade into the right side of Weddle's neck 3 more times. Then as Blackie handed the weapon to Crow, Stryker retrieved another weapon that they had in the cell. It was a thick section of pipe that looked like it had been broken off of a section of a water valve. Before Crow was able to do his due diligence, Stryker swung the pipe in a downward motion and hit Weddle in the forehead area, opening up a gaping wound that exposed whitish gray brain matter. One look at the condition that Weddle's body was in left no doubt to any of them that they were now beyond the point of no return. So by this time, Weddle's blood is all over the cell. They were walking and slipping in it, and the stripping of sheet that was used to wrap around the handle of the weapon was soaked with his blood. But blood was also starting to pool up on the floor around Weddle. Some of the holes in his neck were squirting out blood every time his heart would beat. And this obviously continued until his heart slowed down and the stream got weaker and weaker. So just as Stryker and Blackie had done, Crow sunk the blade into a clean area in the front of Weddle's neck that hadn't been stabbed yet. And Weddle never regained consciousness during the entire time they were carrying out this ritual. He pretty much stayed unconscious from the time he was choked out on the floor. The only signs of life or visible movement was when they were taking turns stabbing him in the neck. His body would occasionally twitch, but this was probably just his nerves. After Crow sealed his place in this pact, then he handed the weapon to Flacco. If Flacco had any reservations about not wanting to involve himself in this incident, he didn't show it. He stabbed Weddle in the neck the same way the other 3 did, and then he stabbed him again in his ear. And when Flacco stabbed Weddle in the ear, they claimed some thick white fluid oozed out that they couldn't identify. They didn't know what it was. My guess is that it was probably brainstem fluid. But Blackie, Crow, and Stryker got a kick out of this. All 3 of them broke out into a gut-wrenching laugh, as if the youngster had just performed some type of unbelievable act. So before Flacco handed the weapon back to Stryker, he stabbed Weddle 3 or 4 more times in the chest for good measure. And being that this was Flacco's first time being involved in something like this, was probably more out of him trying to prove himself, and that he was just trying to show the others that he was willing to spill blood with the rest of them. Later on, the other 3 would describe Flacco's participation in this incident as him being de-virginized, or that this served as his baptism. When they were done and it was obvious that Weddle was dead, Stryker, Blackie, and Crow hid Weddle's body under Stryker's bunk. Later on, Capone would testify that he overheard Stryker telling Gypsy that he had to break Weddle's arms and legs in order to make him fit under the bunk. and they kept him there until they would later get the opportunity to drag him out of the cell and hide his body in the shower. Capone would also later testify that he overheard Stryker telling Gypsy that at one point when he was laying on his bunk, that Weddle's arm apparently fell and hit him in the leg. I guess he laughed about it because he said it kind of creeped him out. Imagine that after everything he had just done. Maybe there was a little bit of humanity left in him. So later on, when the coroner performed an autopsy, he determined that Weddle had been stabbed a total of 19 times in his chest and 12 times in his neck, and that 5 of the stab wounds to his chest were fatal. His left lung was punctured 3 times and his heart was punctured 4 times. The gaping head wound from getting hit with the pipe was done post-mortem, meaning that Weddle was already dead when Stryker hit him. Capone would also later testify that he overheard Stryker telling Gypsy that they also let the youngster participate and that he was de-virginized. Capone also said that the term youngster was a reference to Flacco since he knew he was the youngest in the cell. During that same conversation, Gypsy apparently asked Stryker if they had fucked him up really bad. And Stryker responded by saying, "Yeah, I choked that fool until he passed out. And then we took turns playing with him, stabbing him, everywhere." Stryker then said, "It's taking forever to get the body out of the cell." He said, "We were ready to drag the body out the same day, but the Huras kept watching us. Every time we got the door popped open, they just stood there and watched us. So that fool stayed under my bunk for 2 days." So after the incident, they cleaned up all the blood and then they hid Weddle's body under Stryker's bunk. So eventually they had to come up with the ruse in order to create an opportunity to get Weddle out of the cell. They flooded the tier and then they told the deputies that their toilet in cell 5 was clogged up. Flooding the tier served as a dual purpose. It helped create the ruse to move Weddle's body, and then it also helped them clean up any blood or brain matter that had splattered on the bunks, the walls, or the floor. And their plan actually worked. One of the deputies popped their door open and told them to go ahead and clean their cell and then mop up all the water on the tier. So that's what they did. But here's where they messed up. One of the deputies also went and got a stack of sheets and linens so that they could soak up some of the water. There was standing water everywhere on the tier. So he came back with a big stack of linens and sheets and told them to use those to soak up some of the standing water that had pulled up. After a while, the deputies that were in the control booth, they went on about their business and they stopped watching them. This gave them the brief few minutes that they needed to get Weddle's body out of the cell and drag him into the shower. Capone claimed that he was able to see Stryker, Blackie, and Crow through a crack in his door, hurriedly half carry and half drag Weddle's body to the shower. Capone then said that Stryker and Crow spent about an hour to an hour and a half cleaning the tier. So like I said, here's where they messed up. When the deputies gave Stryker that stack of linens and sheets, the deputy watched Stryker take those and bring him into the shower. At the time, the deputy thought he was just stacking them in the shower, but that later on, the deputy would say that he thought that they were just putting them in the shower, but he had actually at one point seen them soaking up some of the water with those sheets. However, Stryker and Crow tore strips of those sheets up and used them to wrap around Weddle's body. They tore long strips of sheets and wrapped him up until he resembled a mummy, a reference one of the deputies would actually use later on himself. But Lopez, the deputy that provided the linens and sheets, adamantly claimed that he provided and that he seen them take them in the shower. In other words, what he was saying is that the sheets that they would later find wrapped around the body were the same sheets that the deputy gave Stryker. That right there is kind of hard to explain. So at some point while they were out cleaning, Stryker advised Lopez, the same deputy that gave him the sheets, that not only cell 5's toilet was clogged up, but cell 6's toilet was also clogged up, and that they needed him to put a call out to the plumber. This was actually the second part of their ruse. They included cell 6 so that they could get both doors open, 5 and 6, since cell 6 was the cell that Crow was assigned to. They had to find a way to get him back into his cell. And again, everything worked out according to plan. They said a plumber arrived there at B-roll sometime around 10:45 a.m. in the morning, and then both cells 5 and 6 were popped open. I'm not sure if there was a second shower that these guys were locked up in, but it didn't sound like it. It sounded like they stepped in the same shower that Weddle's body was in. So Crow and the other 2 inmates that were housed in cell 6, they were escorted to an attorney visiting room. So then the plumber comes in. The plumber comes in, he goes up to cell 5 and 6, and within 5 minutes, he fixes both toilets. It was just a matter of extracting a couple of towels that were purposely stuffed into the toilet to clog them up. Thumper then said that Blackie, Stryker, and Flacco were then popped out of the shower and were allowed to go back to their cell. Keep in mind, this is the first time that they had been back in their cell after getting Weddle's body out of there with the door locked. I'm sure this came as somewhat of a relief to move a dead corpse that was starting to show mild signs of decomposition. However, as relieved as I'm sure they were, they still had a big problem wrapped up in the shower a few feet away that I'm sure they knew would create some bigger problems once it was discovered. So a few minutes after they were allowed to go back to their cell, Crow and his two cellmates were escorted back into the module and were allowed to go into their cell. Now, everybody's back in their assigned cells. Everybody except for Weddle. About an hour later, Thumper said the deputy came through to do his routine security walk. And it was during this security walk that Deputy Lopez noticed that there was something in the shower that, in his words, resembled a cocoon or a mummy. Assuming that it was a body, he alerted one of his partners to call the floor sergeant and additional staff. So while they're waiting for the floor sergeant to respond, Deputy Lopez and another deputy by the name of Garcia unwrapped the upper portion of the body to ensure that the inmate wasn't alive, and just to ensure that they weren't squandering an opportunity to possibly perform some type of life-saving measure. So when the upper portion of the body was unwrapped, they obviously determined that the inmate was dead. And this is when they realized that it was Weddle, or as they knew him, inmate Robert Tierney. So needless to say, after this incident, a homicide investigation ensued. And almost everybody on that tier was moved to different parts of the jail, or they were moved to high power after being identified as suspects. As I mentioned to you guys early on, Capone, Roland Ramirez, is someone who was coincidentally housed in the Santa Clara County Jail sometime around 2008 or 2009. I don't know a lot about his history or everything that he was involved in, but I remember finding out at some point that they were hiding him out over there because he was being used as a witness in some high-profile Mexican mafia indictments. To find out, this was one of those cases. On a personal note, this dude was a cold character, straight drama queen. He was always getting into conflicts with other people he was on the same tier with, and his favorite thing was gassing people. He liked to play with piss and shit and was known for gassing people. Anyways, all these guys that got involved in this homicide would end up getting themselves caught up in other incidents in the county jail that didn't help them at trial. Stryker, Blackie, Flacco, and Crow were all charged with Weddle's murder and with accessory after the fact. As for Stryker, he allegedly made an incriminating statement after getting into a confrontation with one of the deputies. The deputy told him something to the effect of, "Cool your jets, you're already in enough trouble." Stryker, obviously upset and speaking out of emotion, stated, "Yeah, I'm here on this case and I'm also here for killing another inmate in this jail. So what do I got to lose?" The youngster, Flacco, was moved to a single-man cell on Module 3100, A-Row. Later, his cell was searched and the deputies found a banger. It was described as a piece of metal that was sharpened at one end and bent at the other end. This is a common way of fashioning a handle on a solid flat or a good piece of steel. I've done this before myself. You sharpen one end and then you bend the other end so that it serves as a handle or a grip. So it's obvious that Flacco was learning and that he was taking in all the indoctrination that Stryker, Blackie, and Crow were passing down to him. And then Stryker ended up getting caught up in another stabbing that took place in one of the court holding tanks. When deputies broke up the fight, Stryker allegedly slid the weapon under another cell door and said, "Hey, homie, get rid of that." The other inmate he was fighting with had 8 puncture marks on his back. Then during the trial on January 16, 2001, Crow and Stryker were fighting in lockup and had to be separated. When they got caught, they tried to play it off and said that they were just horseplaying. But after the altercation, Stryker was limping and he had 6 fresh puncture wounds on his left arm and shoulder. When deputies searched their cell after this incident, they found a single-edged blade with blood on it, some wire, and tips of latex gloves used to secrete contraband. It makes you wonder what this fight could have been about. That's what happens a lot of times in cases like this. Politics come into play and people eventually start turning on each other. As for Crow, he was being escorted somewhere in the jail when deputies apparently observed him unhooking his handcuffs, run up to another inmate, and stab him. According to Thumper, the victim was stabbed somewhere in his neck. But deputies overheard the victim say, "What was that for?" And Crow allegedly responded by saying, "I'm just doing my job. It ain't personal. I'm just following orders." So later on, they were all convicted and stretched out. They got 25 to life plus 20 years for prison priors and gang enhancements. Who knows what their status is today, right now? One can only wonder. But one thing's for sure, more often than not, when individuals like these four make these type of sacrifices, they end up becoming victims of the same type of violence that they inflicted on Weddle. Who knows? Maybe they didn't. Maybe they went on to become senors and took their commitment to the hilt. But whatever the circumstances may be, one thing's for sure. They made that existence that they were living in a permanent circumstance, and there's no coming back from that. Again, the lesson to take away from this story is this. Weddle was obviously blinded by his addiction, and unfortunately for him, he allowed it to get him caught up in the wrong kind of politics. I'm sure he trusted Stryker, Crow, Flacco, and Blackie. These were his people. These were the ones that were supposed to have his back. But as I've said so many other times before, politics have become so dirty and so convoluted that you just don't know who you can trust anymore. The way the game's being played now, it's cutthroat, it's treacherous. It's not your enemies that you have to watch out for. It's those who you trust the most. Those that smile in your face and claim to be your friend are the ones you have to keep an eye on. Because as you guys have seen throughout so many of these stories, those that are the closest to you are the ones who will betray you and stab you in the back first. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys liked the story, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like the story, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, we want to thank our viewers and all those of you who continue to tap into the channel. We appreciate the support and we appreciate the fact that so many of you have become loyal viewers. Until then, this is your boy B and I'm out.